Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. Today's show focuses on a very special location in our state, the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. The National Park Service managed coastal area is located on the northeastern tip of Wisconsin. It's known for historic lighthouses, beach and cliff landscapes, and sandstone sea caves, which turn into ice caves in the winter. Shortly before Christmas, I chatted with Bob Krumenaker, the park's superintendent. He's held this dream job since 2002 and has been with the National Park Service since 1977. When you meet somebody who hasn't been to the Apostle Islands or knows nothing about it, how do you describe it to them?
The Apostle Islands are at the far northern tip of Wisconsin, 22 islands in the archipelago, 21 of which are in the place we call the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, which is a national park, and it's the only national park that's fully within the state of Wisconsin. It's undeveloped islands. The one that people have heard of is Madeline. That's got roads and year-round houses. That's the one island in the archipelago that's not part of the national park. So when I talk about the Apostle Islands, I'll, for the most part, be talking about every island but Madeline. But they range in size from 3 acres to 10,000 acres. And they range from a mile offshore of Bayfield area to 25 miles offshore. An island we call Outer Island for obvious reasons. Undeveloped. They're not pristine. People have been here for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But there's more lighthouses here than any other national park in the country. There's some great wildlife, some second growth, but also some old growth forests, some endangered animals. And one of the things that, in addition to the great scenery that I love about this place, is that Lake Superior is a really difficult environment, and people and Lake Superior have been wrestling with one another for hundreds, if thousands of years, and every single time Lake Superior wins, and people come back anyway. And they keep coming back to the Apostle Islands. So there's this layering of history that is in the midst of this beautiful natural area. So there's no better place I know of, and no better place in the national park system where you really can't appreciate the place or understand its story if you only think about nature or if you only think about history. The two are completely intertwined up here. And it's beautiful and it's historic. And it's also an amazing place to kayak or to sail or to hike or to camp or hunt, in fact, in the fall. So great recreational spot, great conservation place, and really pretty too.
What's some of the human history of the park before it was a park?
James Michener, in his books, always starts with the glaciers, so I guess I should start then. The glaciers were here about 10,000 years ago and retreated, and the first people probably, or at least the evidence we have of the first people, goes back maybe 5,000 years, prehistoric Native American cultures. And we don't know a lot about those folks, but there are some archaeological sites. But there are more recent, like 16th, 17th, 18th century Native American usage of the islands. And in fact, the Apostle Islands are essentially the center of the universe for the Ojibwe people. Their migration story takes them from the East Coast to Madeline Island in the center of the Apostle Islands. And so very, very deep connections with the Indian communities who are still here. And that's one of the cool things about this place, is that while there's no people who live year-round on the islands, this was a place that was very important in 19th century treaties between the United States and the Indian nations. And the Indians ceded the territory, but they retained the right to hunt, fish, trap, and gather. And they still do that out here. And then this place, as Europeans moved in, they built lighthouses here because the ports of Ashland and Washburn and Bayfield became really important as the timber industry and the mining industry boomed in the late 19th century. And so lighthouses were built to guide ships into these ports. And then as these ports were eclipsed in their economic importance by Duluth and two harbors in Minnesota, the next several lighthouses were built on the outer fringe of the Apostle Islands to help the ships stay away. So there's this interface of lighthouses and the story of lighthouse keepers, many of whom were also commercial fishermen and farmers. And so there's this layering of 19th and early 20th century history of farming and fishing and mining and timbering on the islands. And there's still a fair amount of evidence of that if you know where to look, and a few places where the Park Service guide people to understand those stories. And then in the latter part, or the middle part of the 20th century, as those industries declined, some of those same people that were fishing recognized the recreational value, and so there were a few early recreational cabins that are out there, and none of them are privately owned anymore. The park itself was established in 1970, and most of the land was private, although some was owned by the state at that time. And former Senator and Governor Gaylord Nelson was the political father of the park, and he saw this undeveloped place in the 1960s and said, we need to preserve the lakeshore, the shoreline, because every place else in America seems like it's being paved over and developed. And he said, we need to protect it. And so his original idea for the park was mostly open space and scenery. I don't think he really recognized the ecological values. We can talk about that a bit later. But really, it looks pretty wild to people right now, and 80% of the land area of the park is actually legally, federally designated wilderness, but every inch of that has a human history as well.
So what are some of the main reasons that people find themselves in the park?
Well, I think most people come because it's an amazing recreational experience. And until 2014, for the most part, that was a summer experience. So our summer season is pretty short. There's not a lot of activity until the end of June, usually because Lake Superior is so cold and the weather in June is really variable from year to year. And the bugs can be fairly bad in June, I have to admit. But from middle to end of June through Labor Day and really into later in September, the weather tends to be gorgeous up here. So some of the best freshwater sea kayaking anywhere in the world. As I said earlier, lighthouses. There are people who just love historic lighthouses, and so we get a lot of people come for that. Great camping, great power boating, great sailing, and for a lot of people that want to sail on Lake Superior, it's pretty daunting to be out there in the big open lake. So here we've got this matrix of islands and water where if you are a reasonably strong beginner, not necessarily an expert, and you watch the weather and you're fairly safety conscious, you can tuck behind islands and learn to become more comfortable on Great Lakes sailing in a place like the Apostle Islands. It's sort of an entry-level sailing place for a lot of folks. But I think what really put us on the map in an amazing way came in 2014 when Lake Superior froze over. It certainly has done that many, many times, even in the recent past, but it froze harder and longer than it had in a long time. We hadn't seen that level of ice for quite a long time. And we have these sea caves along the mainland shore and on two of the islands that are very beautiful, great kayak spots. And in some winters, the ice freezes solid enough that Park Service monitors the ice, and we think it is safe enough to encourage people to walk on the ice and explore those caves. And they're still sandstone caves. The sea caves magically transform to ice caves because they're covered by ice hanging down, and then a lot of frozen ice along the bottom, which comes from the waves from the late fall that are freezing onto the ice. But we saw the longest season of accessible ice caves in 2014 that this park has ever seen. And we had this new thing called social media where the story went viral. And so the largest number of people this park had ever seen over the course of any winter, not specifically the ice caves, but anywhere in the park, or everywhere in the park, had been 10,000 people over the course of a winter. Well, in 2014, we saw 138,000 people in 10 weeks. And that's almost two-thirds of a typical year's annual visitation, all of which has been in the summer. So this park, fairly unknown to most people outside of the upper Midwest, had more hits on its website and Facebook site than any other national park in the country. And we saw people coming not just from all over the United States, but from all over the world. And so now this park is known as an incredible winter destination. But even now, in mid-December, I can't tell you whether the ice caves are going to be accessible this year. We just can't predict that from year to year. But we are now a 4-season park, or at least a 2-season park, a winter and summer park, which is great for tourism. It's great for the economy, and rather challenging for the National Park Service.
What is your understanding of how that went viral? Did you know where it started, or like how did it catch so much fire?
I think a fair amount of the credit goes to the Bayfield Chamber of Commerce and Visitor Bureau, who are good partners of the park. And a number of years ago, I was on the board of that group, very supportive of not just tourism, but of conservation and sustainability up here. But they really pushed with skills that my staff simply don't have to push that out on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And how it caught on beyond that, I don't know. But I really think that they deserve a lot of the credit for getting it out viral. And, of course, the whole definition of going viral is once it starts, you can't stop it anymore. We had no experience with that. We didn't know what we were doing. And the scale was just, we had no idea how big this would get. Unlike a wildfire, which is a disaster, this wasn't a disaster, but it was almost equally scary because we have 2 toilets at the parking lot. And ultimately, we had to rent 18 more to put side by side by the 2. That's how many people we had. We had several days that winter where there were more than 10,000 people in a single day. So I had to hire staff with money at that point I didn't have to manage the crowds and manage the parking. And of course, there were, a certain amount of injuries out on the ice, but I also needed people out there who were checking the thickness of the ice. We didn't have time to give guided talks, but we sure talked to an awful lot of people. And the amazing thing was, for almost everyone, this was a once-in-a-lifetime, or at least first-in-a-lifetime experience. I didn't ever talk to anyone who had ever seen, even if they'd been to the caves before, had ever seen the formations as spectacular as they were that year. And so people were calling it a pilgrimage, and it was incredible. I have a ranger friend who works in Australia. I have a lot of international connections in conservation. And I had actually done a interview with Australian TV station that their crew that was based in Los Angeles, they came up here to do a story. And this went on to the Australian equivalent of the Today Show in their morning thing. And this Australian friend sent me an email saying that he'd seen me on his morning TV over his coffee. And he said, "What the heck's going on up there?" So it was an amazing experience. And I run into people now who have heard about this place in winter and really don't know that we're a summer place.
Can you describe what it's like to be in the ice caves when the lake's frozen over?
Sure. Well, first thing, let me tell you what it's like to get there. It's an adventure to get to the ice caves themselves. So imagine a parking lot that holds maybe 50 cars and has an entrance road from the highway that's between a quarter mile and a half mile long. Well, rarely in the summer does the parking lot fill, although it's been doing that in more years, and sometimes it'll go up along one side of that entrance road to the highway. Well, we saw parking along the highway 3 miles in either direction from that place. So some people had to walk more than 3 miles from their car to just get to the shore of Lake Superior, where they could then begin the trip to the ice caves. So that 3 miles is really a 6 mile round trip. So on top of how far you think it is, you had 6 more miles for a few people. And of course it was cold. it's winter, and 2014, the reason that we had such great ice is it was a really cold winter. That was the winter of the polar vortex, you may remember. Anyway, once you get on the ice, for most people, walking on frozen ice is a very unique and, for some people, very scary experience. Rangers go out there before we open it up and make sure the ice is thick enough. Otherwise, we don't open it, which is why it doesn't open most winters. But the ice is, in order for us to open it, it's got to be at least 10 inches thick, and it's got to be stable between two landlocked points for at least 10 days. But in all honesty, in 2014, by the time we opened it, we had ice that was 3 feet thick, and it was covered with snow. And so it's about a mile walk parallel to the shoreline on the ice, snow-covered. You've got the shoreline on your right, and most of that distance, that first mile, you've got a little beach, although you can't really tell because it's covered by snow, and forest behind it, but not a particularly dramatic shoreline. And then you can see ahead of you the cliffs, sandstone cliffs. They're not very tall, maybe 30 or 40 feet, but they're reddish-brown. And so that's the headland you're looking for, and you finally get there. And then for the next 2 miles, this cliff shoreline is pockmarked by these sandstone caves. And some of them go back as much as 100 feet or so. There's no complete darkness anywhere, but you've got this rock overhang and these very intricately carved pillars and connections between different indentations that we call caves. And so remember that the surface of the ice is completely flat, so you're only seeing half of the cave because there's the other half that's below the water or ice surface. But you've got all these beautiful formations as if you were at Carlsbad Caverns of stalactites, which are the kinds of things that hang down from the top, all made of ice. And they change every day, but because we had this long period of deep cold and not much wind, really finely carved ice formations that make you think you're in some underground cavern somewhere. And it's just spectacular. And most of them are white, but some of them are a bit blue, and some of them are a little bit red based on some of the chemicals that are in the groundwater that's seeping down. But it's like this winter fairyland. And, if you're really lost in it, you might forget that it's 10 degrees outside or less. And hopefully you're wearing really, really warm boots because you're standing on ice for hours at a time. So it's this beautiful ice fairyland, and we discourage people from touching the ice because everyone who touches it breaks something. But, it's just really different, I think, than anything that almost anyone has ever seen before. And the smiles you'd see on people's faces, and the kids were just in heaven. And heck, you're out on Lake Superior. It's frozen. This is the biggest and most dangerous lake in the world, and you're just having this amazing winter experience. So that, because it was the winter of the polar vortex, most of the national news was winter is cold, winter is tough, winter is awful. This was like this amazingly great story that, hey, winter is really cool. And I think that also contributed to the viral nature of it, that people thought, oh, I can go outside and have this amazing experience in the middle of winter.
So you've been there you said about 16 years. During that time, how many times have the ice caves been accessible?
I should know that off the top of my head, but I don't. I will tell you that prior to 2014, 2009 was the last time we had it. And I got here in 2002. Well, the winter of 2003 was my first. And we probably had it maybe every other year or every third year between 2003 and 2009. So it's certainly never been an every year experience. But climate change has had a major impact on Lake Superior. And there's a lot of data, not National Park Service data, but wider data, looking at ice over the last century and a half. And the amount of ice has plummeted. There's about 15 days less per decade than the previous decade on average. So we had this amazing ice year that people were saying, my gosh, I've never seen anything like this. That actually was the average amount of ice 80 years earlier than that. And so they call that in science shifting baselines. We had the caves again open in 2015, but a very brief season. So we had gone 10 weeks in 2014. That's the longest we'd ever been able to open it. And we only had 10 days in 2015. And then it wasn't good enough or safe enough in 16 or 17. And right now, we don't know what 18 will look like.
Do you have like Vegas odds on it this year? I mean, what kind of conditions are you usually precipitated opening up? Do you kind of have like a feeling on it? I mean, obviously a polar vortex helps.
It does, and they're not predicting one. I'm not sure they can. But, we've been working with some scientists because we'd really love to figure out what are the predictive factors. So it would be really helpful for everybody if we could say in December, we've got an 80% chance of it happening, but we simply can't. What we do know this year is that the meteorologists are saying it's a La Nina year, and the overall prediction for this area is for slightly colder than normal, and stormier than normal. And that means a little bit more snow. And those two things actually work against each other. Colder, obviously, is better for ice formation. But stormy means windier and wavier. And the area where the ice caves are is a very exposed part of the shoreline. And so if there are a lot of storms and wind that drives waves before you get the surface freezing, that will keep the surface from freezing. So one of the interesting things is I've been looking at the data from the buoys that they have on Lake Superior that measure the surface water temperature. And I know it's way more complicated than this, but since 2009, there's been a direct correlation, actually 100% predictive between the surface water temperature this time of year and whether or not we're going to have conditions that allow us to open the ice caves. And so if the temperature is above normal, we have not found the conditions safe enough or the ice has not been stable enough that we can open it. If it's below normal, at least since 2009, we've been able to open the ice caves. And I know it's way more complicated than that. So I've been monitoring this really closely. And for most of this year, we were tracking almost on average. And the fall, you'll remember, was pretty warm at first. So we got above average. And then a few weeks ago, it got cold again. So where are we now? We're like right on the average line. So I'm just totally unable to predict. In fact, I'm looking at the website right now and we're like a half a degree above normal right now, but I don't think that's enough to make predictions. So I think the odds are better this year because the overall surface temperature is supposed to be a bit lower, but we would certainly need several weeks of deep cold and not very much wind in order to be comfortable. But I don't predict a day in advance on these things because we simply don't want people to make firm plans for the ice caves. People are always sending our Facebook site questions, often as early as October, November, saying, I want to come up the third week in February. Will the ice caves be open? And I wish I could tell them. What I do tell people is come up the third week in February or whatever week you're planning. Be prepared for the ice caves. Monitor our Facebook site really closely or our website. But you know what? There's a lot of really cool things up here you can do even if the ice caves are not open. And we have an amazingly fun, scenic hiking trail right on the top of the cliffs. And you need to probably bring a hiking pole or ski pole and some crampons or something to put on your feet so that you're not slipping around in the snowy conditions that will often turn to ice when a whole bunch of people walk on the trail. But you can look at the caves from up above, even if it's not safe enough to walk on the ice. And there's skiing up here and dog sledding and lots of fun things to do, even if the ice caves are not open.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about was the wildlife. I like going out and seeing wildlife, hiking around and such. And I know there's some interesting wildlife there. Can you talk a little bit about some of the different animals that people can see or just run into while they're there? Well,
I'll talk about interesting wildlife, but unfortunately, in a heavily forested place without a lot of topography, seeing them is really good luck. But this is not a place like Yellowstone where you can go with, high expectation that, hey, I'm going to get to see something. But probably the coolest thing here that people do see or really love seeing are black bears. The islands have a fairly healthy bear population on them, and we have, in fact, one of our islands has probably the highest density of black bears anywhere in North America. But typically you're not going to see them. It's just good luck or bad sanitation sometimes will attract a bear to your campsite. We have timber wolves. Nobody ever sees them. But right now we probably have a few more timber wolves here than Isle Royale National Park, which is known for its wolf population, ironically enough. Bald eagles are healthy and increasing in population here. In recent years, we have rediscovered a threatened species that was long thought to be gone from here, and that's the American marten, a little weasel-like animal that is really rare, and now we've discovered it on 7 different islands. And then the park is the only place on Lake Superior where the endangered piping plover nests, and they're doing extremely well here. And part of it is because it's a well-protected and managed shoreline with no development on it. So this is a place where wildlife is subtle. It's pretty spectacular, but you have to spend a lot of time before you really see that much of the wildlife here.
What are some of the things that you have to do as far as managing wildlife populations or managing different plant species? How do you, as a National Park Service, how do you manage the land and the different species of life that make that place home?
Well, that's a great question, Craig. Let me start off with some background. Well, what's the objective here? The law that creates national parks has 2 components, and the 2 components are conservation, and in fact the words they use are, we are to conserve unimpaired, and then the other component is recreation and education, because the phrase says, for the enjoyment of future generations. So we like to talk about national parks as being the places where American heritage, natural and cultural, are protected for perpetuity. And so the best kind of management is the kind that we don't have to do. If the place itself is well protected from adverse influences, whether it's development or pollution or encroachment of some sort, well, we might not have to do anything at all. So first thing we try to do is inventory what's here in terms of plants and animals, and identify what are the sort of keystone species that are indicators of ecosystem health, and we will try to monitor those. And so there's a staff of scientists that work for the National Park Service. They're not working solely for Apostle Islands, but they're based in Ashland, and they actually serve about 9 national parks in the Great Lakes. And they, combined with a few people on my staff, are spending time in the parks, counting animals and measuring forests and looking at bat populations and all sorts of things, trying to understand what the health is. But we're also actively trying to restore certain plant environments. This year we did the first ever prescribed fire, meaning a human-ignited fire on one of the islands in a place where fire has been artificially either suppressed or prevented from being started for too long. And what's really interesting about that is the forest needs fire to regenerate, and there's also a very strong cultural component in that Native American peoples used to burn this particular area on a regular basis to enhance blueberry production for their own use. And so we got the tribes very involved, and with the tribal communities and other agencies, we ignited this ground fire in October this year. We'll be looking at how does the ecosystem respond, and we're very optimistic that understory will be cleared out, blueberry production will go up, and that will be a very good thing. I mentioned earlier the piping plovers. In order to enhance the plover population and do everything we can to encourage them to nest successfully here, we station some people out there to monitor nests, to put up fences around the nests, to educate people to make sure they keep their dogs on leash. We've been monitoring very closely bald eagles and their nests and looking at pesticides there. Not a lot of active management, but monitoring how they're coming back after DDT was banned. There are places where there's a fair amount of erosion, sometimes natural and sometimes human caused because people congregate on beaches. So from a vegetation perspective, we will plant native vegetation and try to enhance the recovery of that environment. So fairly light hand on the land, but our job is to know the condition and intervene subtly whenever possible to try to enhance the ecological health of the place. And so, most of that people don't see, but what we do find is that when we tell those stories, people really like the idea that we've got hands-on management. The other thing that's been really important here is that most national parks do not allow hunting or trapping. The distinction here, and the reason it's called a national lakeshore, not a national park, is that Congress did decide that hunting would be permitted and trapping as well. And so we have been able to work very closely with the Wisconsin DNR to manage deer hunting here in a way that really has been very beneficial to not just the wildlife, but to the plant population, because we've got on these islands a rarer assemblage of plants than almost anywhere else in Wisconsin, and deer have a big impact on vegetation, and they will drive the understory plants to the things that they don't like to eat. And because we've got very few deer on most of the islands, we have an understory plant called Canada yew, which once was everywhere in northern Wisconsin, and now it's very, very uncommon. And yet it thrives on the islands here. So while there are several islands that have a long established and healthy deer population where things seem to be stable, in the early 2000s, 2 more islands were colonized by deer. And along with the DNR and the tribes, we made a mutual decision that we were going to favor the rare plant, the Canada yew, over the not-so-rare deer, even though they were both native species. And so we've used hunting and we've used sharpshooters in addition to manage the deer population. And on those islands that don't have a historic deer population, our goal is to have as few deer as possible so that the vegetation would be really healthy. So behind the scenes, I guess the bottom line is we're trying to understand what's the condition of the environment, trying to establish goals of healthy ecosystems for the long term, and where appropriate and where we can do some good, intervene subtly to try to protect that environment and enhance the ecological health. So one of the important things that I like to help people understand is that in addition to being just a spectacular place to spend your summer vacation, in order to assure that a place like this indeed is in the condition that the public wants it to be in when they come out, we need people behind the scenes like biologists and ecologists and fire management people and archaeologists and all the ologists out there, whether they're on my staff or people that I can borrow from another office. But you need a lot of smart people doing stuff to make sure the place is in good condition.
So there's kind of a laboratory aspect to the park?
Very much so. We talk about science for parks to help us manage it, but we also talk about parks for science, because national parks are some of the most pristine in some cases, or certainly uninfluenced or minimally influenced places anywhere left in North America. So these are great places to understand how the world works, and also, particularly in the newer national parks, some of which were fairly heavily impacted before they were established as protected areas, to really pioneer restoration. So some places like the Everglades National Park in Florida or Redwood National Park in California, these 2 parks have some of the most advanced, sophisticated ecological restoration programs anywhere in the world, run by the National Park Service and our sister agencies.
The other thing that I imagine that you're responsible for managing on some level is the lighthouses. I assume they're historic structures that people love to come see, obviously, as you've mentioned. How do you manage those? And can you talk a little bit more about them for the people who are interested in going to see them?
Well, another great question, Craig. And what, as I said earlier, what's so cool about the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore is that you can't really do justice to the story by just talking about nature or just talking about history. And lighthouses are the perfect example of that. The lighthouses, the oldest one in the archipelago was built in the 1850s, and then the last one that was built was the Ashland Harbor Light in 1915. And then there were a couple towers that were replaced after that. But for the most part, it spans about a 60 or 70 year period. And so they're all now more than a century old and some more than a century and a half old. And of course, just preserving historic buildings is hard enough. And then you put them on islands that are only accessible for part of the year, and they're off the grid. They're up on top of bluffs, and there's no power, and it just gets to be more and more challenging. But that's an important part of what we do because they're not making these things anymore. And so this is a fundamental purpose of the national park, which is to try to keep these things standing in perpetuity, which means in addition to the scientific ologists, we need masons and roofers and historic architects and historic landscape architects. And we don't tend to have those people on staff, but when we can, we will contract for those kinds of services. So very fortunate, 2010, Congress appropriated some substantial money for us to rehabilitate a number of the lighthouses. And so most of them are in pretty good condition right now. And Raspberry Island is probably the most accessible. It's kind of the jewel of the archipelago. There is a tour boat that goes out there a few times a week and ranger-guided tours for just a few dollars. And we have essentially restored the light to the condition it was in the 1920s. And so to some extent, you almost feel like you're going in a new building, but it's the 1920s. And it's decorated with period furnishings, some of which are actually original to the site. And we tell the story of the lighthouse keeper and the challenge and the shipwrecks and all the rest. And really, really wonderful, immersive visitor experience. And because it's hard to get to and there aren't a lot of people, you get a very intimate experience with the ranger that gives you the tour. More recently, we were able to restore the old 1856 Michigan Island light, and that had been really closed off to the public for many, many years, and now it's open again. And what's just spectacular is that instead of telling the typical lighthouse museum story, which is always great, but for the most part, you go to a lighthouse, you hear the story over and over, which is the life of the keeper and his family was very arduous. And so we didn't want to do that again, but what we did was kind of look at why would someone build a lighthouse in this unbelievably remote place in 1856 and spend what for the time was a massive amount of money. And so this was right after the Sioux Canal had opened and right after some of the treaties with the Indians that opened up the area to white settlement and commerce. And so we're trying to tell the story of sort of the geopolitics of 1856. What was happening in this place that made this worthy of the investment of the national government, well over 1,000 miles away? You can learn an awful lot about who you are as a people and your connection to the land by going out to the lights. And of course, climbing the towers, when there's a ranger or volunteer that will take you up there, that's great because you get really high, you get this amazing view. And so we have rangers stationed at Raspberry Island most of the summer, open pretty much all day, 7 days a week. And then we have volunteers, and it's a great volunteer experience at Sand Island Light and Devil's Island Light and Michigan Island Light. Occasionally in the fall, there'll also be tours to the Outer Island Light, and someday we hope to have tours to the Ashland Harbor Breakwater Light, although that's not a plan, it's a hope at this point.
So it occurs to me the more that I talk to you that there's just a lot that you're responsible for managing. Why did you get into the National Park Service? Why did you want to make this a career? You said you've done this for about 30 years, I think. Worked at a number of places around the country. Why did you want to get into the Park Service?
Well, it wasn't the plan. I kind of fell into it to some extent. I grew up in the Northeast, a suburb of New York City, and I kind of thought I would do what most suburban, well-educated people would do, something white-collar job in an office. And I was studying engineering. Actually, I was doing a joint degree in engineering and political science at an Ivy-covered university in New England. And I had this very odd situation, and I really hadn't heard about this with other people, although I'm sure there were many, which is I was getting good grades but hating what I was doing. and that's a really bad combination, particularly when tuition costs so much. And so I wanted my sophomore year to just take some time away and do something completely different and clear my head and figure out what the heck was I going to do with my life. And through a series of pretty much random events, ended up volunteering at Canyonlands National Park in southern Utah. And I had never been west of Ohio, and I had no clue what I was getting into. But I had enjoyed the outdoors, and I like to hike, and I like to ski, and I like to do things outside. But I really didn't know a lot about conservation. But not only was I bowled away by the scenery, but I was just embraced by these amazing people that were absolutely committed to this mission of the National Park Service and system, and they took me under their wing, and I came back several years in a row to a variety of parks to do temporary jobs in my summers, and then I took a semester off from college and did that. I just kept doing it more and more and thinking, I like this stuff. And ended up getting a master's degree from another university back in New England. But every time I wasn't in school, I was somewhere in the West doing ranger work, and it just became something that I really loved doing. And my master's degree was really in environmental planning and management, and so it was a mix of science and management and policy. And it turns out that's a pretty good background for what I do today. And so it's almost 35 years actually at this point that I've been doing this, and I've worked in 14 different national park sites or offices, most of which were relatively short assignments. These summer jobs that were 3 months long, or a couple of my early assignments as a year-round employee were maybe 2 years long. But before coming to the Apostle Islands, the longest I'd spent anywhere was 6 years, and that was at Isle Royal. So between Isle Royal and Apostle Islands, I've now been 22 years on Lake Superior. So I never expected to be a superintendent of a national park, but I enjoy policy, and I enjoy science, and I enjoy understanding how all the pieces fit together. And as a staffer working for other people, part of what you try to do is influence other people's decisions. And at one point, I realized that maybe I could become one of those people, and others would try to influence me, but maybe I would have the ability to set the direction for a national park. And I've been fortunate enough to been able to follow that dream. And the Apostle Islands was the number one place on my list when I thought, gee, if I could be a superintendent of any national park, where would I be? And I got the one I wanted, and I feel very fortunate about that.
I know we don't want to stray into politics too much, but I wanted to ask you about, 2016 was a celebratory year for the National Park Service, marking 100 years. And then 2017 was a little bit of a different year. There's just a lot of politics swirling, not to go into it, but I'm just wondering how you, over the last couple of years, how you felt about your service with the National Park Service, and just how are you feeling about the job?
Well, it's complicated, of course. We in the National Park Service tend to like to think that what we do is apolitical, but I'm a federal employee working for a federal agency, and therefore what I do and whether my agency is supported and funded is based on whether or not Congress, exercising what we hope is the will of the people, thinks this stuff is important. And so we have to understand we live in a political world, and so part of the job of a superintendent is to be the eyes and ears for the park and to be working with the elected officials and their staffs so that they understand what we do and hopefully appreciate that. And of course, in my tenure here, we've had Republicans in Congress and we've had Democrats in Congress, and my job is to work with all of them, regardless of their party and regardless of their priorities. But 2016, as you point out, was the centennial year of the National Park Service. Our agency was formed in 1916. And so there was a tremendous marketing campaign and a huge amount of public interest in parks, and that brought a lot of new people. And one of the real goals was to broaden the demography of those who understand, appreciate, visit, and care about parks. And so we were really pushing into communities of color and inner cities, and trying to and kids and trying to educate and welcome and inspire the next generation. And I think that's really, really important. Visitation is at an all-time high in most national parks. And in a lot of ways, that's great. But the challenge, of course, is funding is stagnant or going down. And I don't know anyone who, when they're thinking about their summer vacation going out to a national park, wonders, gee, I wonder whether the toilets will be cleaned. I wonder whether the historic building will be painted. I wonder whether there'll be rangers who will give me tours. They just assume that we're able to do all those things. So my job as a superintendent is to figure out how to manage this place as best I can with whatever financial and staff resources that I can manage to convince others to send this way. And we're very reliant on volunteers and on friends groups. We have a wonderful group called the Friends of the Apostle Islands, www.friendsoftheapostleislands.org, that supports us and helps us with volunteers and some fundraising. And it used to be that friends groups would provide the icing on the cake, we used to say, but more and more of the fundamental needs of the Park Service are not being funded. And so we're very reliant on our friends and donors to help do some of the things that we used to have federal money for. So the job right now is very challenging. Everybody loves parks, but parks are not free. And as I said earlier, with all the ologists behind the scenes, one of my goals is when someone has an amazing experience here and they're open to conversation, is to encourage them to think about what it takes to keep this place in good condition the 51 weeks of the year that they're not here. If they understand or want to understand that, then they're more likely to do what they can as citizens to tell their elected officials, this is important to me, and we want you to support it. I will talk to people about these issues of what's it take to preserve a place? What does preservation mean? Why is this place important? And hopefully between us, we can inspire people to get engaged and assure that parks will be here for another century, because I don't think we can take that for granted.
You mentioned that if you had your choice of being a superintendent at a park, the Apostle Islands was at the top of your list. Can you tell me a little bit about like the first time that you set foot in the Apostle Islands?
It was 1988. I was working at Isle Royale National Park at the time. I was the park biologist. I had an amazing job. And in those days, the Park Service used to do essentially peer reviews between parks. So it was the Apostle Islands' turn to have a peer review, and our regional office assembled a team of people from a number of other parks, and they asked me to be part of that. And so I had never been to the Apostle Islands. I knew where they were. I knew a little bit about them. And when you work at Isle Royale, I have to admit, you kind of think that your park is better than any other island park in Lake Superior, because you're more isolated and you're better known, and you've got these really sexy wolves, or at least you used to. You got moose, you got lighthouses, and you have an amazing wilderness environment. Of 99% of the park is wilderness. So I came to the Apostle Islands thinking, well, it'll be nice, but it's not going to be as nice as Isle Royale. And I discovered Bayfield, which is an incredibly nice place with restaurants and B&Bs and very engaged people. The islands had, because of this matrix of islands close together, huge diversity, and some have resources and wildness that are very, very similar to Isle Royale, and then others a bit more civilized and closer to home or closer to town. And so you can have this amazing island experience and then a nice dinner at night. And I had the chance to spend a week here in 1988 with some peers and got to hike some of the trails and interview some of the park staff, and just discovered this place is cool and a nice place to live at that. And so starting then, I thought, if I ever get a chance to go back there, I want to do it. And 14 years later, I was selected to be superintendent of the park, and that was a dream come true.
A couple more questions. I'll do a speed round here. Do you have a favorite kayaking story?
No, not really. One of the things I guess I'd say about kayaking is it's incredibly fun. It's not as hard as some people think, but it's also not Lake Minnetonka. And so we recommend that people kayak the first time up here with a guide. There's some really talented guides, and they're authorized by the Park Service, and we know that they're reasonably well trained and safe. And so you can go to our website to see which are the authorized outfitters. If you do that a couple times and you're really hooked, and you decide to do it on your own, what's great is we've got day trips like the Sea Caves in the summertime to really arduous multi-day or even multi-week overnight trips, and everything in between. So go to a campsite by kayak, and there's no development on the island other than a couple campsites. The night skies are pretty nice. It's really quiet. It's an amazing experience.
What's your favorite season in the park?
I'd say fall, but the problem is it's way too short. and there's a bittersweet nature to fall because we know that we've got to finish up the work that we didn't get done all summer because we were too busy. And the lake starts to act up, and those gales of November, one of which came in October this year, are scary. But fall is when the leaves turn color, and after all the leaves turn on the mainland, actually, it's a little bit later on the islands. And so it's really, really hard to get to. Very few people get that experience. But the cruise boat goes through mid-October, and it's a pretty cool experience when you can do that. And so you really get to appreciate the isolation and beauty of the islands. And you realize that for the most part, after about mid-October, there may be no human being that sets foot on any of these places until spring. And that's pretty cool.
How tasty are the wild blueberries?
Oh, they're good. It varies from year to year. And in a fairly wet year like this year was, the blueberries can be spectacular. But, the interesting thing in Bayfield is that we've got these fruit farms just up above town, a few hundred feet up, and they grow domestic blueberries there. And so they're different. Wild blueberries are great, but they're really small and a little bit sour. And I still think they're better. But on the other hand, they're hard to get, and most years you can't get them. And so we're pretty lucky that these plumper, juicier, sweeter blueberries are available all summer up here, too.
And the last question I got for you is, do you have a favorite spot in the park?
I've got a whole bunch of them, but even though I can't tell you that federal law prohibits me from telling you what it is, I'm not going to, because I think everybody's got to find their spot on their own. There's a lot of nice ones. The goal that we have for visitors to national parks is we like to call it find your park, find your spot. And for some people it's a lighthouse, for other people it's a sandy beach, for other people it's deep in the woods. So, the good news is I've been here long enough that I've seen a lot of places. There's still one island I've never set foot on, and I may never set foot on that island. But every time I go out, I see something different. And one of the great things about my job is even though I'm in an office in Bayfield much of the time, at least for much of the year, if I need to, I can get on a boat and get out to an island and get that experience and clear my head and realize that this is part of my job. How cool can that be? Love it.
Thanks to Bob for talking about his job in the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. If you're liking the show, please rate or review the show on your podcast service. It goes a long way in helping get new listeners to the show. Also, you can stay in the loop about the podcast by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at wispodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.